congratulations being honored with the Sherry Lansing Leadership Award. How special is this moment for you?
It's incredibly special. It's Sherry Lansing, first of all.
This was never about money. It never had been, but the storm began with a simple Tuesday email, 3 short lines, 1 attachment, and a number that made people freeze. $10 million for a single quote. One silent nod that would alter the trajectory of a failing empire. Charlize Theron did not reply, not out of fear or hesitation, but because her decision had already been made months earlier, and that decision was not a yes. At the core of the chaos stood a studio desperate to salvage a broken image after critics had mercilessly shredded its streaming project, scrambling to rebrand as deadlines closed in, clinging to the hope that a blonde star whose last 3 films were remembered more for their costumes than their plots could somehow save the day. They misread her silence as consent, never realizing her silence was a refusal. The offer had come from a third-party firm, faceless and nameless, but buried inside the metadata was her identity, proof that they knew who they were reaching for, and proof of how recklessly they handled it. And as anyone familiar with the industry knows, every deleted tweet, false statement, and glossy PR cover-up takes hours to unravel. Exposure only requires persistence, and exposure was exactly what followed. The first article broke before dawn, unembargoed, unattributed, glowing with headlines, anchored by a fabricated quote. Blake brings vulnerability to power, and that's rare. A line that Charlize never spoke, not on record, not off record, not even in passing. That quote was ghostwritten by a junior representative inside the PR firm, filed under pending approval from Charlize Theron, but the damning timestamp showed it was published 14 hours before she had even seen the draft. They might have slipped by undetected, but they made the mistake of thinking she was not watching. That same morning, Charlize called her agent with 3 sharp words, not delivered in anger or fear, but with crystalline finality. Pull everything now. By noon her name was scrubbed from campaign decks, and by late afternoon every PR inquiry was answered with a single line: Charlize will not be participating in this narrative. Indie Insider HQ amplified the moment with a tweet that went viral. So Charlize just erased herself from a $10 million deal because someone faked a quote. Hollywood is shaking RN. And with that, she was out. But the unraveling had only begun, because someone within Netflix's strategy department had already circulated a press calendar with her name etched in ink. They tried to backpedal, insisted it was a clerical error, a misunderstanding, but Charlize had no patience for misunderstandings. She specialized in removals. The campaign trudged on, the premiere event unfolded, cameras still flashed, but Charlize was absent, and her absence spoke louder than any choreographed appearance. It was Netflix's Ivory Fire premiere, marketed as the crown jewel of their spring lineup, a film wrapped in themes of resilience, motherhood, and redemption, one that Charlize had once been attached to as executive producer. Her face had graced the earliest teaser decks, her name had carried weight in early promotions, but when the red carpet rolled out, she was nowhere, and the silence hung like a shadow over every flashbulb. Behind closed doors, whispers swirled that Blake's team had seized the narrative, reframing the project as her creative vision, spinning the film into her leap toward emotional maturity. One producer was even quoted by Vanity Fair saying, "This story was always Blake's to carry," a statement that rang hollow as archived pitch decks resurfaced, leaking old casting emails that revealed Charlize listed as EP, only later struck through, her name literally blacked out. The timeline did not lie. She had stepped away, and Blake had stepped into a space never meant for her, a role that did not belong, a silhouette she tried to fill but could not. She had not just taken the spotlight, she had attempted to wear the outline of another, but the dress never fit, and neither did the role. Audiences noticed. The fractures grew more visible with every staged smile, every red carpet pose under soft lighting, every headline that tried to reframe what had already been lost. The silence around Charlize carried more weight than any press release or statement carefully crafted in a back office, and while Blake performed for cameras, Charlize had already moved on, planning her next step with a quiet precision that needed no amplification. Deliberate and icy, Charlize's moves contrasted sharply with Blake's glossy behind-the-scenes posts, because while Blake was sharing curated snapshots and staging her narrative, Charlize had already vanished into the hills outside Florence, standing quietly on a film set stripped of the usual spectacle. No makeup trailers, no brand sponsors, no red carpets, no press. The project, titled Blood and Bronze, carried an intimacy and sharpness that made it feel less like a film and more like a mirror, reflecting back the story of a public figure desperately trying to attach herself to a legacy only to collapse under the weight of her own fraud. The lead character, unyielding and composed, didn't cry or snap. She simply stood still and let the fabrication implode. The real twist, however, was in the casting. The very role Blake once coveted in Ivory Fire had been rewritten into a minor part in Blood and Bronze and handed to Jessica Chastain, a calculated shift that landed like a quiet earthquake. Production began the same week Blake launched her promotional blitz for Ivory Fire, but Charlize never mentioned her new film, never threw shade, never gave the press an easy soundbite. She didn't have to, because while Blake was scrambling to perform a part, Charlize was dismantling the narrative without gossip or tweets, only with a camera and silence. That silence soon became deafening. Blake had Netflix's budget, polished endorsements, and a press schedule planned a month in advance, but she didn't have momentum, the one thing she couldn't buy. Viewers left Ivory Fire puzzled, asking who Blake's character was supposed to be, why she carried no weight, why her presence evaporated as soon as the credits rolled. Meanwhile, Blood and Bronze, an indie with no trailers, no interviews, no sponsor posts, began generating a quiet, almost unnerving buzz. Critics leaned in, writing lines like, "Theron gives nothing and everything. You lean in just to hear her breathe. It's not acting. It's dismantling." Anonymous industry insiders whispered online that Blake's campaign was hemorrhaging money just to mask the silence gathering around her, and one Netflix strategist even admitted the film didn't underperform. The actress overreached. Blake had the machine, but Charlize had the truth and the patience to let it emerge in its own time. And when the silence grew too heavy, Blake made her most damaging mistake. She spoke. The unwritten rule had always been to keep quiet, avoid comparisons, never address the tension directly, but panic over slipping numbers drove her to break script. On a podcast designed to soften her image with stories of career pivots, motherhood, and personal branding, she shifted her tone 34 minutes in, declaring, "There are some women who just age into silence, and I think we're all supposed to clap for that, but I'd rather evolve loudly." The backlash was instant and ferocious. Listeners recoiled. Had Blake just implied that Charlize Theron, aging gracefully and deliberately silent, was irrelevant? The comment, meant as a flex, instead landed as a threat, painting Blake as someone clawing for relevance at the expense of dignity. Audiences don't cheer for desperation, and they didn't cheer for her. Threats never last long in Hollywood because people remember the ones who tried too hard to replace what could not be replaced, and while Charlize herself never issued a direct reply, her film's official Instagram did. One untagged, captionless post that vanished after 12 hours, the only public acknowledgement her team ever made, and it was enough. The silence carried more weight than noise, because when Blake tried to shout louder, she began sounding like someone clawing at relevance rather than owning it. After the podcast backlash painted her as desperate, she pivoted in the way she always did, reshaping her image from a rebranding arc into a reclamation of quiet strength. The new narrative launched with precision. Weeks of speculation gave way to a single stage appearance framed as a message of unity. No press questions, no mentions of Ivory Fire, just one carefully choreographed red carpet and one panel. But the element no one anticipated was Charlize's presence on the same guest list. Blake arrived 20 minutes early, flanked by her glam squad, PR handler, and a personal videographer documenting every second. Charlize, in contrast, entered exactly on time, alone, unadorned, and seemingly unbothered. During the panel, the moderator asked what authenticity meant in an industry built on image. Blake leaned into her script, delivering a polished soundbite. "Authenticity is just showing up, even when it's hard, even when you're misunderstood. The audience applauded on cue, but when the camera cut to Charlize's eyes lowered, then lifted with a faint, measured smile, the moment detonated. In less than 24 hours, the clipped reaction spread to 9 million views, hijacking the very narrative Blake had tried to reclaim. Charlize hadn't clapped, hadn't shaded, hadn't spoken. She had simply looked unimpressed, and that subtle dismissal landed louder than any words. The panel was intended to patch Blake's fractured image, yet the only footage that trended excluded her voice entirely, and the silence of her rival eclipsed the sound of her own branding. Panicked, her team reverted to what they trusted most: money. This time, it wasn't about quotes or podcasts but a full-scale production, a glossy 3-episode documentary with a $10 million budget, a global rollout, and a Dior co-sponsorship, all hinging on Charlize's agreement to appear alongside Blake, even briefly, even silently. The offer landed with precision, but was met with the same steel resolve it always had. Charlize refused outright, offering no apology, no justification, no branding spin. Just a single line released publicly: "I don't participate in documentaries written by the people they protect." That sentence wasn't a mere rejection. It was an indictment, and its echo dismantled the campaign overnight. Dior withdrew. Billboards were stripped. Instagram accounts scrubbed clean. And Blake herself disappeared offline for 6 days, a silence that didn't mirror Charlize's dignity but exposed the void beneath her narrative. That was the last attempt she made to align herself with Charlize, because by then the contrast was irreversible. Whenever Blake tried to sermonize about sisterhood, Charlize's silence reminded the world what integrity sounded like. But the final blow never came from Charlize. It arrived from an unexpected source, someone Blake had trusted, someone embedded within the machinery that propped her up. Charlize had never exposed, never leaked, never needed to, but someone else finally did. A voice from inside, weary of pretending, surfaced in the form of a leaked podcast clip. The woman did not name names, but her implication was dagger-sharp. Let's just say some people get offered beauty contracts in exchange for keeping quiet about campaigns that were never as authentic as they seemed. The revelation reframed everything, showing that Blake's empire was less about artistry and more about transactions designed to buy silence, to erase inconvenient truths, to manufacture applause. And while Blake scrambled yet again to pivot, to polish, to reclaim, the truth had already surfaced, and this time, it wasn't silence that destroyed her, but the voice of someone she never thought would turn. Silence became the loudest weapon, and the first crack came from the voice, a former Hollywood stylist turned producer, once known for dressing red carpet darlings before vanishing from the circuit, who resurfaced on a podcast with a revelation. She recalled how one A-lister was offered 7 figures to stand beside someone she knew wasn't safe, and she had said no. That kind of refusal doesn't earn applause. It earns erasure. Listeners didn't need names, but the internet moved quickly, connecting the dots. Wasn't this about Charlize being offered $10 million to appear in Blake's documentary series? Within 12 hours, the episode was pulled offline, but the damage had already crystallized. Another speaker on a separate industry panel hinted at the same thing, whispering about a quiet list, not of women who caused chaos, but of those who said no, and Charlize was said to top it. Her resistance hadn't been sabotage, it had been strategy. And when that strategy broke the machinery around her, silence itself started trending, recast as resistance, dominating feeds for 3 days straight. Commenters didn't ask what it meant, they understood. One last campaign collapsed, one last fabricated quote went unposted, and Charlize Theron, without interviews, tweets, or apologies, walked away untouched. By the end of the quarter, Netflix's documentary was shelved, the Dior beauty campaign was dead, the narrative had evaporated. Blake had retreated, Netflix had gone quiet, and Charlize had slipped away to Morocco, already immersed in her next role and pointedly ignoring the calls. It was never revenge, at least not in the way most people imagine it. There were no messy feuds, no public rants, no tell-all exposés. Charlize hadn't set out to ruin anyone. She had simply refused to fix them, and that refusal resonated louder than any post, headline, or tweet could. In an industry obsessed with collaboration, the most dangerous answer is no, especially when it comes from someone who cannot be pressured, cannot be managed, cannot be replaced. Charlize Theron didn't destroy anyone. She merely reminded Hollywood that true power doesn't scream. It chooses. It withdraws. It waits. There was no final interview, no closing tweet, no memoir chapter, just one project, quietly announced, funded entirely on her own terms with her chosen cast. Sometimes power doesn't detonate in spectacle. It recedes like a tide, leaving the landscape exposed. And when the noise finally cleared, only one figure remained standing. Not the one who shouted for attention, not the one who begged to be seen, but the one who had never needed to speak at all. 10 million declined. One sentence spoken. Zero regrets.